Welcome to the Skeptic Zone, the podcast from Australia for science and reason.
Yes, it's the Skeptic Zone podcast, episode number 747. 747. I haven't been on 747 for a while. For the 29th of January 2023, Richard Saunders coming to you from a cloudy and very steamy, muggy, sort of moist Sydney, Australia. Coming up on this week's show, apart from the weather report, conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theory leaflet or flyer I discovered in my letterbox. Oh yes, what does the one world government, the H.A.A.R.P, COVID-19, 5G, Agenda 21, and smart cities with LED streetlights have in common? Well, they were all crammed onto a tiny flyer I discovered. Find out more about this flyer and some of its wacky claims coming up at the top of the show. Following that, it's the latest edition of the Australian Skeptics Newsletter, read by Adrienne Hill and written by Tim Mendham. And speaking of Tim Mendham, following that, it's the Book of Tim, a new series of the Book of Tim. And this week, Tim reviews a book created by the Australian Skeptics many years ago called Creationism, an Australian Perspective. Way back in the days when a big item on the Skeptics' agenda was fighting the misinformation and lunacy of the creationists. Then to round off the show, it's back to the Trove archives, where we read a report, a review of the 1990 Australian Skeptics Convention held in Canberra. What did the reporters of the day think of being at a skeptical convention over 30 years ago? A big shout out to my teacher friends who are just getting ready now. The day before yesterday was a day for teachers to gear up, prepare, psych themselves up, do administration and so forth for the coming school year. And how important are teachers? How important are they? So if you're a teacher preparing for a new school year in this part of the world, my shout out goes to you. But now it's time for me to run downstairs and have a cool ginger ale with ice. While I do that, I hope you enjoy the Skeptic Zone. Sometimes, folks, after I put the Skeptic Zone to bed, so to speak, and that's usually on a Sunday morning, I wonder what the week ahead will bring. And sometimes I can go right through to Thursday, Friday, and then suddenly fill up the show with reports or news or something like that. But this week I didn't have to wait long at all. On Tuesday, the 24th of January, as I came home from some TV work I was doing, quite naturally opened up my letterbox. No letters, except there was this tiny flyer written in tiny letters. Now the flyer was only measuring 14.5 centimeters by 10.5 centimeters, or roughly 4 inches by 6 inches. So there must have been many of these printed up on a single sheet of paper, then cut up. And as I look at it now, it's unevenly cut, so it seems to be some sort of a mass production, I guess. And somebody went around the suburbs near my neck of the woods, presumably filling up letterboxes with the following. Now I'm going to read the entirety of this flyer to you, this tiny flyer, and stop along the way for various insights and comments. More lockdowns coming. Mandatory ongoing vaccines. Also, the climate hoax and H.A.A.R.P, H.A.A.R.P, and we'll get to that in a moment, the coming orchestrated famine and 5G depopulation plan for a one-world government communist, currency, digital, and religion, Chrislam, Chrislam, Project Bluebeam, and the role of COVID and the vaccines in this agenda. Ooh, this all sounds very interesting. H.A.A.R.P, H-A-A.R.P, stands for the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, and it is a favourite of conspiracy theories about how governments or some secret cabal can control the environment. A quick look on Wiki tells us the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, H.A.A.R.P, was initiated as an ionospheric research program jointly funded by the US Air Force, the US Navy, and the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. It was designed and built by BAE Advanced Technologies. Its original purpose was to analyze the ionosphere and investigate the potential for developing ionospheric enhancement technology for radio communications and surveillance. Since 2015, it has been operated by the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Now, much further down the page here on Wiki Conspiracy Theories, it says, H.A.A.R.P is the subject of numerous conspiracy theories. Various individuals have speculated about hidden motivations and capabilities of the project. For example, Rosalie Bertell, I think that's pronounced, warned in 1996 about the development of H.A.A.R.P as a military weapon. And other people have written how H.A.A.R.P is fully operational and has the capability of triggering floods, hurricanes, droughts, and earthquakes. That would be something. Over time, H.A.A.R.P has been blamed for generating such catastrophes as well-known thunderstorms in Iran, Pakistan, Haiti, Turkey, Greece, and the Philippines, and even major power outages. The downing of TWA Flight 800, Gulf War Syndrome, and chronic fatigue syndrome. So just about everything you can imagine. Goes on to say 2 Georgia men arrested on drug charges in November 2016 were reportedly plotting domestic terrorism based on conspiracy theories about H.A.A.R.P. Now, the other things mentioned in that first paragraph, or the first points made here on this flyer, I need not go into 5G depopulation. I think that speaks for itself. The one world government, typical conspiracy theory. But I will mention this Project Bluebeam. It says here, Project Bluebeam and the role of COVID and the vaccines in this agenda. And I didn't know about this Project Bluebeam. According to a report at news.com.au, dated from 2015, Project Bluebeam conspiracy theory suggests NASA has secret plans to create a new world order. A conspiracy theory about NASA's secret plans has gained momentum after a series of bizarre events. But is it complete nonsense, writes Matthew Dunn. And this report says, in part, when a bizarre event was captured on film showing what appeared to be dark skyscrapers floating in the clouds above China, the world was puzzled. I don't remember that one. While scientists were quick to dismiss the occurrence as a mirage, not all agreed. In the days after the event, one particular conspiracy theory started to gather serious momentum. The belief the sighting was the result of a secret NASA mission known as Project Bluebeam. The theory suggests NASA and the United Nations are planning to create a new world order by using technologically simulated mind control to shape a global new age religion. And that report goes on. Towards the end it says, is there any evidence to suggest the theory? As you would expect with such a highly contentious topic, there are strong beliefs supporting and discrediting the conspiracy theory. And it lists some of the conspiracy theories there. So that's a quick overview of Project Bluebeam. And as this report is nearly 8 years old, I guess it was a bit of a fizzer. Maybe Bluebeam was discontinued. Maybe it didn't exist in the first place. Maybe it worked and we're all under its spell. But we have barely scratched the surface of this flyer. We read on. Join Maria Z. Spelt Z-E-E-E. Or if you're in the United States, Z-E-E-E. Maria Z. Join Maria Z interviews on zmedia.com. as she talks to uncensored healthcare workers, doctors, virologists, politicians and other experts from around the globe about Agenda 21, Agenda 2030, the approaching Great Rest plan of the WEF, WHO, CDC, IMF and Royal Houses of Europe to implement this on the entire world, an agreement signed by over 185 countries in 1992. Be informed of the real purpose of the digital ID and vaccine passports, the real purpose behind smart cities, meters, and new LED streetlights. All right, so who is Maria Z? I can't find terribly much about her online, although she is an Australian conspiracy theorist who has some YouTube and Instagram and Facebook posts talking to other like-minded conspiracy theorists. She has a shop at zmedia.com selling reasonably expensive shirts with slogans like, quote, share the truth at whatever cost, end quote, and, quote, vote one Jesus, end quote. So one can gather that she may be somewhat religious. Now, I did find a little bit about her here and there. There's a report here from the Australian Associated Press. It says a video on social media claims official UK government data proves COVID-19 vaccines dramatically weaken the body's immune system. An Australian-based anti-vaccination activist makes numerous claims about the COVID-19 pandemic and COVID-19 vaccination in an hour-long video posted on Facebook and Instagram. At one point, the activist, called Maria Z, claims COVID vaccines are leading to a condition she calls VAIDS, V-A-I-D-S. And I won't go on, but it makes other points about some of the claims that she makes in her video. Towards the end, it says, the Australian Associated Press, AAP, fact-checked recently debunked claims that mRNA COVID-19 vaccines cause damage to children's organs and has done multiple fact checks on vaccine misinformation. The existence of VAIDS has also been debunked in fact checks by Reuters, the Associated Press, the AFP, Australian Federal Police, Polyfact, and Health Desk. Now, I won't go into some of the other claims here about, what do we have? Smart cities, meters, and new LED streetlights. I wonder what they could do to you. Anyway, we'll read on. The next paragraph says, and it starts off in all caps, this is not about health. It is about a one-world government. Do not comply. Do not vaccinate. Trust in God. Other platforms, rumble.com, bitchute.com, brandnewtube.com, brighteon.com, stopthecrime.net. Videos on above platforms. Sequel to The Fall of the Cabal. Johnny Cash and the Smart Money Nightmare. The Cooking of Humanity. 5G and graphene oxide. The WHO's plan for 10 years of pandemic and lockdowns, and I guess that means the WHO. 10 years of pandemics and lockdowns. The dimming. Rosa Corey Agenda 21. Project Bluebeam. There's Project Bluebeam again. 2030 Unmasked, Part 1 and Part 2. Monopoly? Revelations. There's a lot to unpack there. But just quickly, I looked up Rosa Corey, and she is involved with spreading information, shall we say, about Agenda 21, and claiming that that will lead to control of all the Earth's resources and population. We read on. Detox. Have plenty of vitamin C and prepare extra food and water. Copy all info as cyber attack is planned. Now, at the bottom of the page, this tiny flyer, in its own little box, we read, Henry Kissinger, in a speech to the World Health Organization, WHO, Council on Eugenics. February 25th, 2009. Now, of course, Henry Kissinger being the former Secretary of State of the United States in the Nixon era, a long time ago. And the quote here is, quote, "Once the herd accepts mandatory forcible vaccination, it's game over. They will accept anything, forcible blood or organ donation, for the greater good." It goes on, quote, "We can genetically modify children and sterilize them for the greater good. Control the sheep minds and you control the herd. Vaccine makers stand to make billions, and many of you in this room today are investors. It's a big win-win. We thin out the herd, and the herd pays us for providing extermination services. Now, what's for lunch, huh?" End quote. Dr. Henry Kissinger. Now, I sent this flyer around to some of my friends and reporters, and it didn't take long for Adrienne Hill to send this page back to me. And this comes from Reuters, dated the 26th of May 2020. False claim. Henry Kissinger quoted about mandatory vaccinations. Social media users have been sharing an image that shows a photograph of former US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger with a quote about forced vaccination attributed to him. There is no evidence Kissinger ever said this. Examples can be seen here and here, with links to basically what I've read out. And the story goes on. Henry Alfred Kissinger was the 56th Secretary of State from 1973 to 1977, Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs from 1969 to 1975, and served in several other significant political positions. He was jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1973 for negotiating a ceasefire in Vietnam. Currently, he is the chairman of the international consulting firm Kissinger Associates, Inc., and this year, Henry Kissinger turns 100. Reuters could not find any evidence that Kissinger said this quote about mandatory vaccinations. Kissinger's representatives confirmed to Reuters via email that the quote is a, quote, complete fabrication, end quote. Henry Kissinger's speeches are archived on his website, and only 2 are listed for 2009. Neither presentation included the quote in this claim. In 2009, Kissinger did not speak at a World Health Organization event. Reuters could not verify an event titled WHO Council on Eugenics. A spokesperson for the WHO confirmed to Reuters via email that no such council or event exists. Verdict, false. There is no evidence that shows Kissinger ever said this quote about mandatory vaccinations. This article was produced by the Reuters fact-check team. Well, I must say I'm not surprised. So I must wonder about the mindset of the people who download this information, print it out, and chop it up, more or less evenly. It's a little bit rough. It's not quite even anyway. Print it out very smallly, by the way, very small. You almost need a magnifying glass to read this. In fact, I took a scan and I blew it up on my screen to have a good read of it. And it contains so many absurdities and easily debunked ideas and notions and conspiracy theories all rolled up into one, and ultimately, I guess, a plea to Jesus or God or something like that. A smorgasbord of conspiracy theories in my letterbox. And I wonder, no matter where you are listening to this from around the world, I wonder if occasionally you come across such information in your letterbox, or maybe on a street post or on a bulletin board or somewhere. The conspiracy theorists never sleep.
The Earth is only 6,000 years old. That's what Answers in Genesis and the Creation Museum say, and how can a museum be wrong?
Isn't Dr. Oz just wonderful? I loved today's episode. It didn't talk down to his adoring audience of women at all.
Science has proved that the subatomic quantum realm is as real as it is counterintuitive and bizarre. Therefore, I can use it to support quantum healing and quantum consciousness. After all, how can journals like Aquarius Metaphysics be wrong?
Evolution is just a theory. After all, if we came from monkeys, then why are there still monkeys?
We all have friends and family who believe these things and much more. Well, if you're a rational thinker who is tired of arguing on social media and never getting anywhere, we have a solution for you.
Join the Guerrilla Skepticism and Wikipedia team, and we will teach you how to add reliable scientific and skeptical information to the world's #1 source of information, Wikipedia.
We write new articles and improve existing ones. We remove pseudoscience, paranormal, and alt-med claims, substituting the actual facts. And we operate in many languages.
We've already reached tens of millions of people searching for information, but as you can imagine, we can never do enough.
So please join us. All you need is a PC and the desire to help educate the planet. In fact, you'll be educating the world while you sleep.
Contact us at gsowteam@gmail.com.
Guerrilla Skepticism. The time is now.
Music by purpleplanet.com.
Hello everyone, this is Adrienne Hill from Canada, here to read the highlights from the Australian Skeptics Newsletter. This is newsletter number 165. You can subscribe to this newsletter and get it delivered to your inbox every other week, complete with links to all the stories. Just visit www.skeptics.com.au. But now let's see what Tim Mendham has for us this week. Hi all, says Tim. We were saddened to hear of the death of Skepdoc H.A.A.R.P. With the death of Skeptical Inquirer editor Kendrick Fraser late last year, and now Harriet, the skeptical world has lost 2 key figures in a short space of time. But the weird and wonderful world carries on regardless. Read on, Tim. Vale Harriet Hall. Harriet Hall, who used to write under the moniker Skepdoc, died suddenly on January 11th. Though suffering during the last few years from declining health, including heart failure and arrhythmias, she continued to offer her informed and often scathing observations on pseudomedicine and quackery. As Stephen Novella says in an obituary, quote, "She was always fearless and tireless in promoting and defending science, reason, and above all, what she considered the best interest of her patients. She was driven by the desire to protect the public from misinformation, exploitation, and the bad science and thinking that lead to bad medicine," end quote. Harriet visited Melbourne in 2016 for the Australian Skeptics National Convention, where she gave a presentation on fun with alternative medicine. Anti-vaccine group relaunches as founders face charges. Anti-vaccine flood relief group Aussie Helping Hands, which raised $500,000 for flood relief victims, has relaunched under a new name, claiming that it was cleared of misappropriating funds. As the Crikey website reports, last year the group was the subject of an investigation by the Queensland Office of Fair Trading. Some followers of the group on social media began to question how the money was being spent. After this was reported, the group started to include what Crikey describes as, quote, vague, unverified descriptions of spending, end quote. Wave goodbye to Nessie. An explanation for Nessie sightings has been put forward that relies on the monster's home in long and deep narrow lakes used by heavy vessels. All sizable vessels create a wake in deep water if traveling at a constant speed. Firstly, a disturbance created by the screw propellers trailing in line behind the vessel, and secondly, a wake created by the bows spreading out both sides at a particular angle. This is known as the Kelvin wake and is always at an angle to the direction of the vessel at 19.5 degrees. This could be an explanation for sightings of Nessie moving through the water. Poor sleep and paranormal beliefs. A new study published in the Journal of Sleep Research has investigated paranormal beliefs in relation to a wide range of sleep variables. A sample of close to 9,000 people who completed a survey initiated by the BBC Focus magazine reported on their demographics, sleep disturbances, and paranormal beliefs. Poorer subjective sleep quality, such as lower sleep efficiency, longer sleep latency, shorter sleep duration, and increased insomnia symptoms, was associated with greater endorsement of belief in the soul living on after death, the existence of ghosts, demons, an ability for some people to communicate with the dead, near-death experiences being evidence for life after death, and aliens having visited Earth. In addition, episodes of exploding head syndrome and isolated sleep paralysis were associated with the belief that aliens have visited Earth. I don't know what exploding head syndrome is. Oh, God. Hey, Siri. What is exploding head syndrome?
Here's what I found.
Exploding head syndrome is an abnormal sensory perception during sleep in which a person experiences auditory hallucinations that are loud and of short duration when falling asleep or waking up. Huh. Okay. I wonder why it's called exploding head syndrome. Wikipedia, Skeptics, and the Paranormal. A critical and long article looks at the skeptical approach of the paranormal, how the paranormal is portrayed on Wikipedia, and takes some swipes at the skeptical community and some notable individuals, including Susan Gerbic and her organization Guerrilla Skepticism on Wikipedia. A name which the article repeatedly gets wrong, as it does with the description of Gerbic as a, quote, Wikipediatrian, end quote. U.S. report on UAPs. The U.S. Office of the Director of National Intelligence, or ODNI, has looked at a total of 510 UAP, or Unidentified Aerial Phenomena, reports as of August 30th, 2022. It says that, quote, the observed increase in the UAP reporting rate is partially due to a better understanding of the possible threats that UAP may represent, either as safety of flight hazards or as potential adversary collection platforms, and partially due to reduced stigma surrounding UAP reporting, end quote. Initial analysis and characterization of 366 newly identified reports says that 26 were characterized as unmanned aircraft systems, or UAS, or UAS-like entities, which often means drones or such like. 163 were balloons or balloon-like entities, and 6 were attributed to clutter. Quote, many reports lack enough detailed data to enable attribution of UAP with high certainty, end quote. No mention of aliens. Why people consult psychics. This is a conversation article on why about a quarter of Brits have consulted a psychic, including Prince Harry, who revealed that a psychic, possibly Sally Morgan, contacted his dead mother, Princess Diana. The article lays out the lack of evidence to support psychic contact, but suggests there may be some benefit in using psychic services to cope with grief. I wonder what Susan Gerbic would have to say about that. Ghost hunting apps. The latest apps available on your phone to scout out ghosts include the musical Spotted. Ghosts which, quote, works by playing an eerie ditty if there is an unusual spike in the electromagnetic field around the phone or a sudden movement. This should be appealing to any spirits of the long dead and act as a trigger to encourage them to engage further, end quote. The tune is based on those old winding toys that play tinny-sounding classical pieces. Then again, this other story has a list of the best fake ghost detector apps for Android phones. They don't really detect any ghosts. Quote, but if you're looking for something to just play around with or even prank and make someone scared that there's a ghost around, these apps are perfect for that, end quote. Apps that don't really reveal ghosts? What a concept. Bolivian airline enlists psychic to find missing feline. Bolivia's state-owned airline, BOA, apparently enlisted an interspecies communicator to track down a lost cat after a passenger's pet went missing in transit. The airline stopped its search after a week, though it did agree to pay the owner's cost while she kept looking around the airport in the Bolivian city of Tarija. The psychic, remotely working from La Paz, has been in touch with the owner of WhatsApp to say they sensed Tito is still alive. But there is, so far, no trace of the missing feline, though the airline has been fined for poor procedure in handling the animal, which was possibly never loaded onto the plane in the first place. Oh dear. South African cops spooked by vicious ghosts. Police officers in the South African province of Limpopo abandoned their police station for a few days late last year following an allegedly vicious attack by ghosts. It allegedly took place a few days before Christmas and New Year. The officers said they had to abandon the station as they feared the vicious ghosts would attack them. They drove around their village until dawn because the ghosts had turned the station into their playground, they said. Lights were flickering on and off, a gentle wind in the toilet, no jokes please, and the cries of, quote, unusual wild animals, end quote, and footsteps, quote, similar to a giant elephant, end quote, which assumes you know what a giant elephant sounds like. It also makes you wonder how the cops would react in a real emergency. Well, that's all for now. Until next time, this is Adrienne Hill signing off from the land of the Chinook winds, which gives us a lovely break from cold temperatures during the winter. For example, today it's a wonderful 9 degrees Celsius out. Everything is melting. Tomorrow is supposed to be quite nice again. But by Saturday, Canada time, the Chinook is going to leave and winter will return, with the high being minus 16.
Hola, les habla Paula desde la hermosa ciudad de Buenos Aires, en Argentina. Cuando escuchamos podcasts, escuchamos los mismos que escucha todo el mundo, como The Skeptic Zone. Ojalá puedan venir a visitarnos algún día. Los esperamos con nuestras riquísimas comidas locales y hasta podemos ir a bailar un tango. Mientras tanto, sigan disfrutando de su dosis semanal de ciencia y pensamiento racional. ¡Chao!
And now, a reading from the Book of Tim with Tim Mendham.
Hi, I'm Tim Mendham. I'm Executive Officer of Australian Skeptics Inc. and I'm the editor of our quarterly magazine, The Skeptic. And I'm reading today from the past issue of the magazine from September 2020, in which we have part of our book reviews, which we have every quarter. I looked at one of our books, just to be different. And the book is, of course, Creationism, an Australian Perspective. Creationism was a big issue, especially in the 80s in Australia. Not so much now. But this was our first major publication, and I'll tell you about it. Anyone in publishing will tell you that the magazine industry is going through difficult times. It's a fact of life that the public are not reading as many magazines as they once did, at least not in hard copy. Younger and many not so young readers are exclusively turning to digital media. and often items that are more bit-sized or bite-sized than those long-form articles and commentaries that are the mainstay of print magazines. This means that advertisers are following suit, going digital, appearing in targeted social media, and eschewing the printed versions. It's difficult to maintain any sort of publication in these circumstances. Commercial organisations whose magazines once flourished with a high ad editorial content ratio of 60 to 40, either 60% ads and 40% ordinary editorial, in some cases 70-30 or even higher, which means you had to wade through a lot of ads before you got to the reading material, are these days feeling the pinch of declining ad revenue. Ratios may be the reverse of what they were once, which means the financial support is rapidly diminishing, along eventually with many of the magazines themselves. Magazines that are published by organisations, often with little if any paid advertising content, rely on member fees, reader subscriptions, or generous benefactors to keep going. Staff are rarely paid, and neither are contributors, and the magazines must rely on a continuing supply of volunteers to keep up production and content. Unfortunately, while volunteers may mean well and may have pertinent skills, eventually they get tired or bored, exhausted, frustrated, or simply too old to continue. Finding a supply of fresh blood is difficult, especially as the pool of experienced and reliable writers, editors, and publishers gradually diminishes with a declining industry. Finding the dollars to pay the publishing bills, particularly with declining subscriptions, is equally difficult. And this is equally true of skeptical publications. Wikipedia lists 48 skeptical titles, but it must be said that a fair proportion of those are more newsletter than magazine. Some are not strictly skeptical, either they may be designed for the rationalist, secular or humanist market, and some, sadly, no longer exist. But even rarer than skeptical magazines are skeptical books, put out by skeptical organisations themselves. Obviously, there are books created by commercial publishers. Prometheus Books is a leader in the field, but publishing by most not-for-profit skeptical organisations is, in the main, limited to soft-cover magazines, and even those, as explained, are often stretching the resources of an organisation's members. One skeptical organisation that has bucked that trend, albeit relatively early in its existence, is the publisher of the magazine that I'm reading from, The Skeptic. Australian Skeptics was launched in 1980, with the first issue of The Skeptic magazine appearing in 1981, thus making us the second oldest English-language skeptical group and skeptical magazine in the world. In the early days, interest focused on classic skeptical paranormal topics like UFOs, astrology, psychics, unknown creatures, etc. But the most serious issue facing skeptics in Australia in the 1980s was creationism, and specifically the teaching of anti-evolution, religious fundamental, quote, creation science, unquote, in science classes in Queensland schools. It was not surprising, therefore, that two enthusiastic skeptics from that state wanted to put out a book rebutting creationist claims from a scientific perspective. Australian skeptics agreed and encouraged Dr Martin Bridgstock and Dr Ken Smith to compile and edit an extensive collection of articles submitted by experts in their fields. Topics covered included human evolution, carbon dating, the age of the Earth, physics and the speed of light, dinosaur and human, footprints, Noah's Ark and the flu, as well as a history of the creationist movement internationally and in Australia, and a review of strange comments made by creationists. The result was called Creationism, an Australian Perspective. It was an instant hit, going through 3 editions and 4 printings between January 1986 and July 1987. The 4th expanded edition was added in 2001. It was not the most sophisticated publication from a design perspective, but its content packed a punch. The book's later editions conclude with a call to arms. Quote, "The corruption of science and of science education would be grave by itself. However, the success of creationism would set a precedent which should be as frightening to fundamentalist Christians as it is to scientists. It would establish that a fanatical minority, armed with errors and misrepresentations, can impose its ideas upon every child in a state school system. Our duty as responsible adults is clear. We must defend the integrity of our science and our education, and do our best to give our children the best start we can for the morrow, close quote, because that still applies today with various topics. The campaign in which this book played such an important part successfully pushed creationism in Australia back into what its minority support deserved. It also raised the profile of Australian skeptics with the general public in Australia as an organisation dealing with serious issues in a serious manner, and not as just a quaint bunch of curmudgeons dealing with trivial issues such as UFOs and the Loch Ness Monster. It also raised Australian skeptics' profile in the international skeptical community, positioning it as an activist organisation willing to put itself on the front foot and publicly and energetically, and we would hope effectively, engage with those who would use pseudoscience for personal gain and influence. Australian Skeptics still holds that reputation, and for good reason. It has proudly remained activist, and comments are often made by individuals from other countries that they wish their own group were as active as Australian Skeptics. The Creationism book was intrinsic to the reputation and the development of the skeptical movement in Australia. There were other publications. A reprint of Gellerism Revealed, a book by magician Ben Harris on Uri Geller's spoon-bending techniques, and Skeptical, a compendium of short articles on a range of 36 skeptical topics from aliens to water divining, put out by the Canberra Skeptics. But with all due deference to the efforts of the authors and editors of those publications, none had the impact of creationism and Australian perspective, both within the creationist debate and the broader nature and role of skeptical organisations. And incidentally, to the instigators of the publication, as Bridgstock and Smith were made Australian Skeptics' first life members for their efforts. Those interested in the debate and the scientific counter-arguments, which sadly are still necessary as creationist claims have ironically evolved little over the past 30 plus years, can download a free copy of the book using the link that is tinyurl.com/creationism-ost-skeptics. And there will be a link to that Creationism book where you can download it in the show notes. And we have to thank Skeptic Peter Bowditch for being the custodian of that copy of the book. I'm sure you would enjoy reading it, if only from an historical perspective, although the arguments against creationism still stand and are still valid. Thank you. So that was Tim Mendham reading from the Skeptic magazine from a book review called The Good Book from September 2020, issue of The Skeptic, and you can download that issue of The Skeptic along with virtually every other issue since 1981 off our website skeptics.com.au.
The Skeptic, the journal from Australian Skeptics. Subscribe online to the world's second oldest skeptical magazine. Just visit www.skeptics.com.au and click the magazine link. There you will also find, free to download, almost 40 years of back issues. The Skeptic, the journal from Australian Skeptics, available as a physical copy or as a digital copy delivered to your inbox. Time once again to go back to those digital archives at Trove, trove.nla.gov.au, the online resource from the Australian Government and the National Library of Australia, full of resources going back decades and decades and decades. Printed reports, newspapers, magazines. I think you get the idea. And as I like to say, you never know what you're going to find. I was trawling the Trove, and I came across an account of an Australian Skeptics Convention held way back in 1990. And this comes from the Canberra Times, dated the 16th of June, 1990. Confronting old dogmas with new tricks, Robert Macklin goes in search of the skeptical soul and sets a challenge for dedicated doubters. No, it wasn't a standing ovation, not quite. But the roar of applause from the crowded lecture hall rolled over me in waves. It was the next best thing. A glow formed in the pit of my stomach and then expanded itself to fill every extremity. Surely there can be no more delightful or corrupting feeling. The moment it ends, you want it to start again. Suddenly, you realize why performers never retire. It is instant habituation. The occasion was the annual conference of the Australian Skeptics, held in Melbourne last weekend. As the author of that book, I had been invited to put the case that, quote, the skeptics should tackle religion, end quote, an area they have eschewed since their inception 10 years ago. To such an audience, it would be seen as a very congenital proposition. But in fact, the skeptic establishment was dead against it. To take the bull by the horns, as it were, was, they felt, to invite organisational destruction. So, as soon as I agreed to put the case, they closed ranks and nominated the national president, Mr. Barry Williams, to oppose it. And Mr. Williams is a most formidable opponent, a practised debater, a figure of persuasive authority. Moreover, they had organised for other state presidents to put questions from the floor in the form of mini speeches desecrating the proposition and calling my motives into question prior to the vote. But that wouldn't take place for a few minutes. Meantime, the speech that had kept me awake for the entire previous night was over, done, and the applause was like champagne. In 25 years as a journalist, this is the most difficult story I have written. The nature of the journalist is to report the words and deeds of others. But what if you find yourself at the centre of the story? Alfred Deakin had a solution. He remained a journalist for a London newspaper while keeping his day job as Prime Minister of Australia. He would write the most authoritative dispatches concerning cabinet decisions and government initiatives for his English readers, but he invariably used a nom de plume to keep his identity secret. In my case, that would be simple deception. But how does one write the damn things without appearing like an unpleasant self-promoter? This is the 6th draft, and I still haven't figured it out. The astrologer, one Douglas Parker, was adamant. His predictions actually worked no less than 85% of the time. What went wrong with the other 15%? Asked a questioner from the floor. "I'm not God," replied Mr. Parker. "Not yet, anyway," he said. This became clear when he left the conference in a huff. His battery was flat, and the car wouldn't start until the RACV, and that's an auto club, arrived an hour later. Barry Jones, a former Minister for Science, officially opened the proceedings on the Saturday with a speech which seemed to confuse skeptic with cynic. He is a man in anguish. Discarded from the ministry, where at least he had some access to the great decisions of state, he now cries out from the wilderness. It is an appeal for foresight, for anticipation of the crisis which await us. He used an analogy which struck listeners as being a little unfair. Idealism. If a sceptical approach had been taken in Cabinet to many of the decisions confronting government, only the immediate benefits would have been considered. This would have prevented a wide range of initiatives from taking place, immigration, manufacturing, and scientific research among them. An audience, largely comprised of immigrants and scientists, nodded vigorously. They were on his side. But Barry was lost in his voluminous notes. The first substantive session involved the Professor of Education at Monash University, Dick Guston, and the former Deputy Prime Minister, Dr. Jim Cairns. Their topic concerned critical thinking and/or idealism in science education. It was not really a debate, since their arguments only rarely touched and never overlapped. In fact, Professor Gunston's critical thinking performance was more a classroom presentation than a speech. Out came the overhead slides, many of which contained selected sentences from his address designed presumably for the slow learners. His main, indeed his only, theme seemed to be the assertion that science teachers needed to be more rigorous in their methods and practices. Again, no one demurred, except for the Filipino woman in the front row who interrupted the professor's 83rd slide by suggesting that his rigour had not extended to spelling. Exaggerate, she said, had 2 G's. He should at least have had the grace to blush. Dr. Cairns abused and excoriated what he termed the patriarchal society in which we find ourselves. Our concern should be more organic than sexual, he urged, but without telling us just how this might be achieved. Physically, the years have been kind to him, but few in his audience were able to follow his reasoning, and, unfortunately, he looked and sounded like a patriarch. The mid-afternoon break was the first opportunity to get a good look at my fellow skeptics up close. This being the first and only organisation, apart from the Australian Journalists Association, that I have joined, I was anxious to discover the calibre and style of the skeptical soul. They were, I have to say, an unusual-looking bunch, ranging from the solid core of academics, who take an oath along with their doctorate, I suspect, to present themselves oddly to the world, and the new breed of central Victorian farmers and their gifted wives, to the ageing ladies one often finds in literary societies, to displaced Middle Europeans with a strident point of view, to, and this was the surprise, ordinary suburban Australians who had flown or driven from Adelaide, Sydney, and Melbourne's outskirts to take sustenance from the society of fellow doubters. There's a saying that, quote, pretty girls don't join the skeptics, end quote, and, on the evidence, that's true too. After the break, we really got down to business with an old-fashioned debate between a medico, Dr. Carl Wieland, managing director of the Creation Science Foundation, and Dr. Neil Archbold, PhD, from the Geology Department of Melbourne University. Their topic, Creationism. Can it be part of science education? Dr. Wieland spoke first, and one must give him points for sheer courage, for if there's anything which seems to encourage a skeptic, it's the idea that the world was created a mere 10,000 years ago, and that all the fossils were the result of Noah's flood. But without being exact on the dating, that's precisely what Dr. Wieland argued. Moreover, his presentation was measured, calm, and quite without histrionics. If only he had an actual case, he might have carried the day. For Neil Archbold was bombastic, strident, and clearly in the thrall of his research files. And he made the silly mistake of arguing on the creationists' grounds, of trying to disprove their absurdities rather than forcing them to make the case. Thus we had what seemed like several hours of discussion on the issue of freedom of speech and the right of a child to hear an alternative view. And when Archbold pointed out that there were 106 registered religions in Australia and asked why Wieland's fundamentalist Christian should be the only alternative offered to the scientific viewpoint, he even had an answer for that. The other religions, he said, had their God acting outside the system. Only the Judeo-Christians involved him, with a capital H, in the actual creation. At the time, it almost made sense. Dinner at the Holmes Glen Conference Centre, which is not the Ritz, was informal and fun. My two opponents in the morrow's debate, Barry Williams and Mark Plummer, the Victorian president, took us through 10 years of Skeptics Foundation and adventures, paid tribute to Dick Smith and Philip Adams, who assisted at the birth. And Mark Plummer did a trick. How did he do it? He didn't say, but my table had figured it out before the dessert arrived. Sunday morning was free time for the participants, while the establishment plotted to wipe the floor with the Canberra upstart. First up was The case for astrology. And what an awful anticlimax that was. Poor Douglas Parker, with his 85% strike rate, was billed as a member of the Federation of Astrological Associations of Australia. But his opponent, astronomer Dr. Stephen Roberts, was called to the telephone as the debate ended. The Federation had rung to disown Mr. Parker and all his works. By then, Mr. Parker was trying to start his car. Two medicos, and medicos is a slang expression here in Australia for a doctor or somebody who is involved in medicine. Two medicos found common ground on the use of alternative medicine for quite some time, and with the aid of more overhead slides than you can poke a stethoscope at. Then, at last, the decks were cleared for the great religious debate. Magic. Our chairman was the distinguished academic James Grant. I was first up, and I gathered my speech between trembling fingers and approached the lectern. I now believe in magic. When the roar of applause finally died, Barry Williams stepped up to the microphone. "I agree 100% with Robert," he said, and turned his back to the chair. Unfortunately, he didn't stay there. In fact, it was a terrific debating ploy. He returned to the lectern and launched a full frontal attack, but he might have overdone it, for when the questions and the attacks from the floor were done and James Grant called for a show of hands, well, I wish I could say that modesty forbids, but, I wasn't fair dinkum. We creamed them. Not that it makes any difference. The whole thing will now go back to the state committees and they'll reverse the decision. And then I will resign in indignant protest, and never again will I find myself in this absurd position of reporter as participant. But it really was terrific. I wonder if there's any actual money in giving speeches to crowded lecture halls. And that article was by Robert Macklin in the Canberra Times, and that dates from the 16th of June, 1990. So there you are, an account of an Australian Skeptics Convention almost 33 years ago. Another generation, other points of view. It's interesting to look back into the past and see what skeptics were doing way back then. Well, that's quite apt, really, because later on this year, the Australian Skeptics National Convention will once again be in Melbourne. I wonder if Dr. Steve Roberts might step up to the microphone one more time. And a big shout out to all my friends, of course, in Melbourne. I think I'll pass this clipping on to Tim Mendham for safekeeping or reference or recording. And it's really is a really interesting snippet. What do they say? What's that expression? A piece of time, a time capsule, a snapshot. That's the expression. A snapshot of history. But you too can find all sorts of snapshots of history by going to Trove at trove.nla.gov.au, because, as I have discovered, you never know what you might find. Thank you for listening to the Skeptic Zone podcast, the last Skeptic Zone podcast for January. Next Skeptic Zone podcast, 748, will be on the 5th of February. And some of the items we'll be covering in Trove, for example, will be iridology, looking into your eye to determine your health. Another edition of the Book of Tim, and in her continuing series on wiki projects, Adrienne Hill will look at cryptozoology, strange and fantastic beasts unknown to science. Thank you to the supporters and friends of the Skeptic Zone who Contribute at Patreon or PayPal at skepticzone.tv if you want to join the crowd, the throng of people who chip in just a little bit every month or every week. You know, $5 a week, $2 a week, $5 a month, $10 a month. It all helps enormously and keeps the show going. And speaking of going, it's time for me to go. So until next week, this is Richard Saunders signing off from Sydney, Australia. You've been listening to the Skeptic Zone podcast. Please visit our website at www.skepticzone.tv for show notes, contacts, and to access the back catalogue of episodes going back to 2008. You can follow the Skeptic Zone podcast on Twitter at Skeptic Zone, visit our Facebook page, or leave a review on iTunes. You can also support the Skeptic Zone via Patreon or PayPal. The Skeptic Zone podcast is an independent production. The views and opinions expressed on the Skeptic Zone are not necessarily those of Australian skeptics or any other skeptical organisation.
That's what I'd say. I think we should do a tour later on of the gardens of Skeptics Towers.
What? You could tell the listeners about the lizards that come.
That's right. We could. The wildlife around here. There's dragonflies. There's cockatoos. Yes. Koalas.
There's planes.
The odd kangaroo coming through. We've had foxes here.
Foxes here.
Yeah, here. Yeah. I've had a fox. He was sitting there watching telly, and a fox just walked past along the decking.
What?
Stopped, looked in at it. We looked at it, and then it ran off. I've seen a fox in the front garden, then run up the street.